In the last video, I went over a lot of the best of what 2015 had to offer in the way of video games. So many good titles for all systems, really. But in this one, I think it's time we get a little more cozy. The top 5 games of this year are not only worth recognition for this one year alone, but probably all deserve to be considered among the best of all time, as large of a pool as that may be. The greatest of 2015 certainly was great, and ironically, most of it came wearing green. Back in 2013, we got to see a reboot for one of the most iconic characters in video game history, Lara Croft. Personally, I thought the game was good. It looked pretty, the shooting mechanics were solid, even the minimal RPG elements were nice. Yeah, the characters were pretty cliche, but still serviceable. I honestly liked it. Although not as much as everyone else apparently, because this game was put alongside the likes of BioShock Infinite, Grand Theft Auto 5, and The Last of Us, as not only one of the best games of that year, but one of the best games to ever come out during the 7th console generation. My goodness, people were crazy about it. Yeah? I guess I see where people are coming from, sorta. Now if that same praise were levied on the sequel, I think it would make a lot more sense. While not groundbreaking in any way, Rise of the Tomb Raider is definitely a step up from its predecessor, improving in every single aspect save for one, but I'll get to that later. The gunplay is more refined, the environments are more varied and obviously better looking. You actually raid tombs, and they're a lot of fun to boot. The characters are a riot. Rather than being a bunch of stereotypes, they're now over-the-top insanity, and it's great. Heck, even Lara, who I thought was pretty bland and uninteresting in the first game, is actually kinda fun. Yeah, she's a bit of a lunatic now, and you almost wonder if you should even be rooting for her at times, but she's actually a character of her own now. Rather than being the typical level-headed but lovable protagonist we get out of most action-adventure heroes, she's actually a little too obsessed. Now the voice acting is still a bit silly, and her pacing and motives are as stilted as the last game, but it's an improvement. As for the bad, well, one thing I've always preferred in Uncharted over this game is the controls and how they translate to the physics of your character. For a 3D platformer, Lara feels a bit too stiff in her movements, yet the physics surrounding her feel too loose, and it makes for a pretty uncomfortable sensation every time you take a leap. Not to mention I find myself walking off of edges pretty darn frequently, and the way she stops and goes breaks the immersion often with just how ridiculous it looks. But that aside, this game is great. Is it the definitive treasure hunting 3D platforming action hero experience? No. Almost. I mean, if you ask me personally, that's still Uncharted 2, but it's still great, and a real winner for Xbox owners. Honestly, I can't help but recommend it. Check it out and see for yourself. I'm going to be honest, 2015 was really a down year for Nintendo. And ask even the most die-hearted Nintendo fans and they'll probably agree. Aside from about 4 AAA releases on the Wii U and a couple of 3DS games, their fans had almost nothing except a little DLC here and there. So thankfully, a lot of Nintendo fans, especially of old, had something really great to grab onto when a certain Earthbound-inspired indie title took the internet by storm in the latter half of the year, featuring most, if not all, of the elements that made the Earthbound and Mother series so great, but also while staying entirely its own thing. Sounds like a masterpiece by design, and to a lot of people it is, but I think it's only fair I talk about it in full before jumping to that conclusion. Undertale, created by one developer under the name of Toby Fox, it released on Steam in September and was an instant smash hit thanks to its exposure all across certain platforms such as Starmen.net, which is the biggest hub for all things Mother related, and its pretty successful, if not small, Kickstarter campaign. It's a quirky turn-based RPG where yes, you can kill everything in the game, but that's not necessarily the idea. The idea is on the characters you run into and do battle with, but I'll get into more on that in a minute. The battle and leveling mechanics themselves are very simple. Your power is really just determined by your level. There's no real underlying base stats or special moves or any of that stuff. A couple of equipable items, but hardly anything else. The way you avoid taking damage is a bit more creative, but aside from that, it's really standard. Now, I'm going to lay down a harsh truth here, but if you don't like the 8-bit pixel aesthetic, you won't find anything good here visually. And yes, the game does occasionally feature these trippy graphics, but again, it's nothing above what Earthbound did back in 1994. The puzzles are neat, and some of them even led me to a good chuckle, while others are very standard. If you couldn't tell, for the most part, this sounds like a very basic RPG. And it is. Until, again, you get to the characters. The characters are what make or break this game, and for most, it makes it. Honestly, they're all well fleshed out. Their personality is incredibly unique and interesting. Their dialogue is fantastic, the interactions all memorable, and really, it kinda makes sense as to why a lot of people really do think this is the best game of the year, simply because of these characters. It's much like any great book. Rarely is a character-driven book memorable if the characters themselves aren't interesting, and here they achieve that status in spades. See, this is why I said make or break. Undertale's biggest strength is unfortunately also its biggest flaw. If, like most people, it is successful in roping you in and in making you fall in love with these characters, I can guarantee this game will stick with you for a long time to come. But, if you're like me, you'll absolutely hate it. I'll admit I'm in the minority on this, but as far as video games are concerned, I'm more film-minded rather than book-minded. For me, a great story is told much better through visuals over dialogue. Heck, I'd much rather play a game that's all pretty visuals and no talking rather than the opposite. This is where Undertale falls flat. While it is superbly well written and the characters are incredibly well done, never did I feel that they're very alive because their actions on screen really gave me that indication. That's just how the game was designed, and it's not necessarily a bad thing for everyone. I would have had this higher on the list if this game's biggest upside wasn't also its downfall, because let's be fair, most of the people that have still avoided it up to this point probably won't like it. If you're like me or just someone who doesn't like RPGs in the slightest, I'd give it a pass. However, if you really do like RPGs but have only avoided this for reasons such as that god-awful fanbase, tell them to screw off, then do yourself a favor and check this game out. Also, the music is pretty great too. What a year it has been for poor old Hideo Kojima, one of the greatest game developers in the world, held hostage by his own company, scared that what would likely be his final contribution to one of gaming's most storied franchises, and that later turned out to be true, simply wouldn't be good enough for the fans. And after the backlash of the sort of prequel that we got last year from Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes, we were all kinda worried too. Thankfully, that was just one of the earliest of many stunts being pulled by the reigning king of worst developer in gaming, Konami. And Metal Gear Solid 5, The Phantom Pain, is actually an extremely good game. But not in the way most people would expect. In fact, in some ways, this could be considered the worst in the core series. And considering how good 1 through 4 are, that still doesn't necessarily make it bad, but the rest of this game is probably the best of what Metal Gear has ever had the chance to offer. So let's start with the two major problems in this game. Story and the ending. Whoa, whoa, whoa! Hold on there, those sound like two big caveats. Should I really be putting this game above Undertale and Rise of the Tomb Raider and, well, a whole mess of other games? I have a point. Just hear me out. Metal Gear Solid 5's story is, compared to the rest of the series, pretty pathetic. It has far fewer cutscenes, a confused way of telling its story, and is bundled together pretty poorly. And for die-hard Metal Gear Solid fans, the ending of this game pisses you off. Not because it's necessarily bad, but because the actual intended ending we all knew would link this game and the first was completely cut out. That being said, most of the performances are still strong. The story is pretty darn good, again, just not by Metal Gear Solid standards, and the opening to this game is powerful. Honestly, that's the worst this game has to offer. The best? Well, where do I even begin? The mechanics in this game all surpass the other entries in the series tenfold. Yes, there isn't much of an emphasis on stealth anymore, and it is entirely possible to go into most scenarios guns blazing, which some would say defeats the entire purpose of MGS, but it's so well refined, so well executed, the massive variety of ways you can tackle a mission are astounding. Not only is this gameplay the best in the series, but it's pretty safe to say this is the best action game we've seen in a few years. That says a lot. The graphics are of course astounding, and the music, wow, is it ever good. The controls feel great. Big Boss does it very well as a third-person shooting bad A mother effer. And the amount of content this game packs will blow your mind. While for fans of the series this game was a bit of a letdown, and I understand why. If you've ever had an interest in this series but you were turned off by the stealth or the more dated mechanics, this is a great place to start. It's extremely accessible to newcomers, which in some ways is a good thing. I think most people who get invested in this game, through its gameplay, could go back to Subsistence or Guns of the Patriots and find something incredibly special. It is by no means the best in the series. I think Snake Eater will forever hold that title, and most will probably agree with me. but it's still a dang good entry in one of the best series in all of gaming, even if it's for some of the reasons people weren't expecting, let alone hoping. It's a shame that the most important aspect of Metal Gear Solid took a back seat, but at least it allowed everything else to shine as a result. I think that's more than enough to warrant a very positive recommendation. Horror is not a genre I am the most fond of. Rarely do I ever get scared, but that unsettling and creepy feeling I get otherwise isn't something I actively seek out, unless there's a good story to it like with Silent Hill 2. Unless you're talking about Bloodborne. Okay, no, Bloodborne is not technically a horror game, at least when talking about the combat. It's like Dark Souls. Like exactly. Because it's the same developer and a spiritual successor. Duh. But this game absolutely oozes atmosphere. Like seriously. If ever there was a definitive, creepy, haunting, dreadful, and hellish landscape in video games, it certainly belongs to Bloodborne. I love it, and I know I'm not the only one. Yharnam is one of the best worlds in video games, there's no doubt, and in a strange way that makes it beautiful. If that was all, I'd honestly consider putting this in the top 5 on that alone. It's that good. But this is Bloodborne. Of course that isn't all. The gameplay is as refined as the Souls series has ever gotten. Enemies are as tough and punishing as ever. This game will kill you. Badly. And often. This honestly is not my kind of game. I'm not a person who actively seeks out challenge in video games. It's just not the most appealing aspect to me. But unlike Dark and Demon Souls, here I actually feel rewarded, with more of this and more of this. This game in some strange and twisted way is so unbelievably fascinating. I honestly don't have much more else to say about it. It's Dark Souls, but what separates it is the atmosphere. It's leagues above the rest of the series and really above most games period. And if you're someone who is in it for the challenge, I doubt you'll find anything better, because every time you die, it's your fault. And you have to learn from your mistakes if you want to progress in this game at any time. What more can I say? It's the best thing to come out for the PS4 this year, and I highly advise you pick it up. Video games are, in many ways, and at the very least by definition, a form of art. And like any other form of art, whether it's visual or audible, the caliber of said game can very much be boiled down to what it does right and wrong, rather than just because it is. There's a reason we critique video games, but I think there's a certain level of objectivity one must acknowledge if you're even willing to give something a chance. You can like a game and say it's terrible, and you can absolutely hate a game even if it's pretty clear that it's well designed, and for most people, a lot of fun. I expressed this with Undertale earlier. Of course, part of the problem with Undertale for me is that it's not a genre I typically like, and in no way did it serve to change that. I think that's what separates the great from the extraordinary. It's one thing to find a game that's at the top of its class, showcasing the best of what its genre has to offer in every facet, but it's incredibly rare, and in some cases impossible, to find a game that sets itself above and beyond the rest in such a way that it feels like a disservice to the game to simply classify it by genre. For me, a game that does that is Ori and the Blind Forest. I'm a bit picky with platforming games, I'll admit. There's a fine line between what I do and don't find enjoyable with these games, and typically if platforming is the main focus, I don't like it at all, especially if it's a side-scroller. Ori is, by concept, a platformer, a difficult one at that, but let me tell you what makes it exceptional. Most people who haven't played the game have at least seen the first 10 minutes. It's a scripted sequence that sets up the story, and most people agree it's pretty darn emotional. Right from the get-go, this game sets the bar with arguably the most beautiful aesthetic ever put on screen, some of the best music I think has ever come out of a game since Journey, and some very, very well executed visual storytelling, which in its own right is pretty impressive considering it's all being done from one camera angle, the whole time. After the opening, the rest of the game is pretty simple. Traverse the world, learn all sorts of nifty abilities, save the forest, all that good stuff. The story isn't too difficult to latch onto, but it is emotionally gripping. And I have to say the soundtrack plays a big part in ensuring the player feels it. If you are an emotional gamer, I do advise having a handful of tissues on standby. But let's talk about the gameplay. I could not, in good conscience, put this game at number 1 if it wasn't for the superb gameplay. The controls are magnificently tight. Aside from one or two very specific instances in the game, I'll get to those later, it always feels like your fault when you die. This game is an exercise in patience because you must quick save often or you will be punished for it. At the same time, it isn't hard to be patient because there's so much to appreciate along the way. Every ability you unlock is useful, almost equally so. There's no Legend of Zelda syndrome here. Once you get something, expect to use it throughout the rest of your adventure. It's an add-on to your arsenal, not a gimmick for that specific area. The character designs are great. The landscape is great. As I heard it once said, the forest in this game is very Studio Ghibli-esque in its design, full of interesting but threatening monsters, a good portion of which are fictitious. And, I must stress it again, the soundtrack here is breathtaking. I think if this game had received the same recognition as Journey, the score would have as well. I'm talking Grammy nominations. Just listen to this. It's simply wonderful. Now, no game is perfect, but I can't deny it does take some nitpicking for me to really find flaws. But I suppose it wouldn't be right of me not to talk about them. There are a couple of scripted chase sequences in this game, and while only one of them is especially guilty of this, they all feel much more like trial and error rather than a test of your reflexes and skill. Again, especially during the sequence later in the game, sometimes things will come out of nowhere that you couldn't really predict, and it does feel like a cheap death. But getting any of them down never takes more than a minute, and the end reward is always satisfying. Not to mention the visuals ramp up significantly during, so they're still not outright terrible. Really, this is nitpicking, and otherwise I have no problem with the game. Aside from Undertale, it's the cheapest game in this top 5 at only $20, but will provide you with as much playtime as the $60 titles. It's one of the best experiences I've ever had with any video game, and I think it's going to be pretty difficult to beat for a very long time. Ori and the Blind Forest is my number 1 game of 2015. Thank you all so very much for watching, and here's to another amazing year for video games.